The morning started like any other on the colony world of New Haven, with children running through the streets on their way to school and parents waving goodbye from doorways that gleamed in the orange light of the system's twin suns. Sarah Morrison watched her daughter Emma climb onto the transport with her friends, laughing about something only 8-year-olds found hilarious. And Sarah smiled because this was exactly the life she had wanted when she moved her family to the frontier colonies. 5 years ago, 2,000 years had passed since humanity's last war. A conflict so terrible that it nearly destroyed Earth and left scars that still ached in the collective memory of the species. The unification conflict had been humanity's darkest hour, when nations turned on each other with weapons that could crack continents and poisons that lingered for generations. Billion people died in those years. When the survivors finally stopped fighting, they made a promise that echoed through every generation since. Never again children learned about the wars in school, saw the images of burned cities and mass graves, understood what their ancestors had been capable of doing to each other. It became humanity's defining characteristic when they finally reached the stars and met the Galactic Assembly, a coalition of 47 species that had been sharing space for millennia. Other species watched humanity with careful eyes at first, studied their history with what seemed like academic horror, but eventually decided that humans had truly changed. 2,000 years of peace spoke louder than ancient wars. Humanity became known as the reformed species, the ones who had conquered their violent nature through sheer force of will and cultural evolution. The Galactic Assembly grew comfortable with human presence. Even complacent, they forgot that choosing peace was not the same as being incapable of war in New Haven. Sarah went about her day managing the colony's water reclamation systems, completely unaware that in orbit above her world, ships bearing the insignia of the Zelthorn Concordat were moving into position. The Zelthorn were one of the Assembly's most powerful factions, a species that prided themselves on order and regulation. 3 months earlier, they had pushed through the juvenile custody directive over human objections, claiming that some frontier colonies were not meeting educational standards set by the Assembly. The human ambassador had argued against it, filed formal protests, but the vote passed anyway. Most species saw it as a minor administrative matter, nothing worth serious concern. The Zelthorn enforcers descended on New Haven without warning, their ships blocking all outgoing communications. As ground forces moved through the streets, Sarah was in the filtration plant when she heard the screaming. She ran outside to see Zelthorn soldiers in their distinctive gray armor herding children into transport vehicles, using stun weapons on any adult who tried to intervene. Sarah ran toward Emma's school, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might tear through her chest. She found the building surrounded, teachers unconscious on the ground, and Emma nowhere to be seen. A Zelthorn officer stood near the entrance, consulting a data pad with the casual efficiency of someone completing a routine task. Sarah grabbed his arm, and he turned to look at her with large, compound eyes that seemed utterly indifferent to her terror. "Where's my daughter?" Sarah demanded, her voice breaking. "The children are being taken into protective custody, pending review of educational compliance," the officer said in perfectly translated Terran standard educational compliance. "They're children, you can't just take them. Their juvenile custody directive grants the Assembly full authority in such matters," the officer replied. "Already turning away your colony will be notified of the hearing schedule within 30 standard days." Sarah lunged at him, but a stun blast dropped her to her knees, muscles spasming by the time she could stand again. The transports were lifting off. The same scene played out across 3 colonies that day: New Haven, Prosperity Station, and Far Reach. 2,847 children, ages 5 to 14, were taken from their homes and parents in less than 6 hours. The Zelthorn moved with military precision, clearly having planned the operation for months. Within 12 hours, the children were off-world, moved to processing centers deep in Assembly space. The human ambassador to the Galactic Assembly was a career diplomat named Marcus Webb, who had spent 30 years building bridges between species and advocating for peaceful cooperation. When the news reached him, he felt something crack inside his chest, a sensation he later realized was the sound of every diplomatic instinct he possessed shattering against a wall of pure rage. He demanded an emergency session of the Assembly Council. The Zelthorn representative was a dignified elder named Krath, who listened to Marcus's protests with what appeared to be patience. Ambassador Webb, your emotional response is understandable, but misplaced, Krath said when Marcus finally stopped shouting. The children are in no danger and are being well cared for in appropriate facilities. You took them from their parents without warning or legal process. The directive provides all necessary legal authority. Krath replied calmly. Your frontier colonies have been operating outside established educational norms for years, and the Assembly has a responsibility to ensure all juvenile beings receive proper development. The other Assembly representatives nodded along, some looking sympathetic to Marcus's distress, but clearly viewing this as an internal administrative matter. Marcus realized with growing horror that they didn't understand. They saw this as humans being difficult about regulations, not as an act that might shatter to millennia of carefully maintained peace. Return the children immediately, Marcus said, his voice dropping to something quiet and cold. Or what? Krath asked, not unkindly, but with genuine curiosity. Will you threaten us, Ambassador? Will humanity abandon 2,000 years of peace over a custody dispute? Marcus looked around the chamber at representatives from dozens of species, all watching him with varying degrees of interest or boredom. None of them showed fear. None of them understood what they had just done. I am asking you, Marcus said carefully, as someone who has dedicated his life to peace between our peoples, to return those children to their families before this becomes something none of us can control. Your request is noted, Krath said. The children will be returned once compliance reviews are complete, and we estimate that process will take approximately 6 to 8 months. The session ended with nothing resolved. Marcus, he walked back to the human embassy building, feeling like he was moving through a dream. His assistant met him at the door. Face pale, sir. I'm getting reports from Earth and the colonies. She said, what kind of reports? Every government building on Earth has crowds outside, and the colonial defense volunteers are mobilizing without orders, and recruitment centers are being overwhelmed. Marcus felt his hands start to shake. How long since the news broke public? For hours. Sir, for hours. In 4 hours. Humanity had heard that someone had taken their children. Marcus thought about the history lessons every human child learned, about the unification conflict and the terrible things humans had done when they stopped choosing peace. He thought about 2,000 years of restraint, of carefully taught control, of a species-wide promise to never let their capacity for violence define them again. He thought about what happened when you took a human's child. Get me a secure line to Earth's Defense Command, Marcus said quietly, and then start evacuation protocols for all non-essential personnel. His assistant stared at him. Sir, are we expecting a war? Marcus looked at her and felt ancient despite being only 53 years old. I'm expecting that humanity is about to remember who we used to be, he said, and I don't think the galaxy is ready for that. Admiral Sarah Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the TDF, Combrance, and watched the recruitment numbers scroll across her display with something close to disbelief. The 72 hours since news of the children's abduction had spread across human space. The Terran Defense Fleet had received over 40 million volunteer applications. 40 million. The TDF had been a peacekeeping force for 2 millennia, running rescue operations and defending colonies from asteroid strikes and natural disasters. They had 800 ships and maybe 200,000 active personnel. People were flooding recruitment centers faster than the centers could process them. And Sarah could see in their eyes something she had only read about in history books. Her communication officer looked up from his console. Face tight, Admiral. The Geneva yards are reporting that civilian workers have retooled 17 heavy cargo haulers into troop transports, and they're asking permission to continue. They don't need our permission, Sarah said quietly. The yards are civilian-owned, ma'am. They're following military specifications from the restricted archives, and they shouldn't have access to those files. Sarah pulled up the yard manifests and felt her stomach drop. The specifications were perfect, exactly matching designs that had been sealed away after the unification conflicts. Someone had unlocked the archives. Someone with very high clearance had decided that humanity needed access to its old demons, Let them work, she said. Finally, and prepare to receive the completed ships into active service across human space. Similar scenes were playing out on Earth. Dr. James Chen taught history at the University of New Beijing and had spent his career studying the unification conflict from a safe academic distance. Specialized in the psychological factors that had allowed human beings to do such terrible things to each other. And his lectures were always packed with students trying to understand how their species had survived its own nature. 3 days after the Zelthorn took the children, James arrived at his classroom to find it empty. He checked his messages and found a single line from his teaching assistant. "We've enlisted, and so has everyone else." James walked to the nearest recruitment center and found a line stretching for blocks young people who had been studying philosophy and art and mathematics. Now stood waiting to sign up for military service. He recognized one of his best students, a young woman named Anna, who had written a brilliant thesis on nonviolent resistance. "Anna," he called out. She turned, and he saw her eyes were red from crying. "Professor Chen," she said, "I thought you'd be here. What are you doing?" "What I have to do," she said simply. "They took children, and the assembly won't give them back, and someone has to go get them." "There are diplomatic channels," James said. Hearing how weak the words sounded even as he spoke them, the diplomats tried. "Anna said the assembly doesn't care, and they think we won't do anything because we haven't fought a war in 2,000 years, and they're wrong." James looked at the line of volunteers, saw the grim determination on faces that should have been carefree. "You've never held a weapon," he said to Anna. "None of you have." "Then we'll learn," she replied. "Our great-great-grandparents knew how, and it's still in us somewhere. And we'll find it." James went home that night and did something he had never imagined doing. He accessed the restricted military archives using his academic credentials and started reading operational plans and tactical manuals and weapon specifications. Knowledge came easily, terrifyingly easily, as if some part of his brain had been waiting for exactly this information. Meanwhile, in assembly space, the Zelthorn High Arbiter Krath reviewed intelligence reports about human activity with growing irritation. Ships were being built, personnel were mobilizing, and there were signs of significant military preparation. But this was humanity. The species that had forsworn violence for 2 millennia. Krath consulted with his military advisors, who assured him that human posturing was simply that. Posturing meant to pressure the assembly into political concessions. They have not fought a war in their entire spacefaring history, his chief military analyst said. Their fleet is designed for rescue operations, and their soldiers are trained for disaster relief. And they have no combat doctrine. And yet, they are preparing for something. Krath observed. Preparing and doing are different things. The analyst said if they were truly serious about military action, we would see offensive deployments, and instead, we see defensive consolidation, and they are simply protecting their borders while they negotiate. Krath wanted to believe this. The alternative was that the assembly had made a catastrophic miscalculation. And that seemed impossible. They had the support of 47 species, fleets that numbered in the thousands, and military traditions stretching back millennia. Humanity had peace and good intentions in 2,000 years of not fighting, though. Math seemed clear on the colony world of New Haven. Sarah Morrison sat in her empty house and cleaned a weapon she had never owned, before the local defense volunteers had opened their armories and were training anyone who wanted to learn. Sarah had been at the range every day since Emma was taken, learning to shoot and move and fight. She was a water reclamation engineer. She had never hurt anyone in her life, but she could still feel Emma's arms around her neck during their last hug, could still hear her daughter's laugh, and when she closed her eyes, she saw Zelthorn. Soldiers herding children into transports. Every parent on New Haven was training every parent on prosperity. Station and far reach the galaxy had taken their children, and now those parents were becoming something the galaxy had never seen. Armed, trained, and absolutely unwilling to stop until their children came home. The Terran government issued formal demands for the children's return. The assembly scheduled hearings for 6 months in the future. Humanity issued an ultimatum: return the children within 72 hours or face appropriate consequences. The assembly backed by species that had known only human compliance and cooperation. Dismissed the ultimatum as an empty threat, they sent a formal response noting that the juvenile custody directive was legal under assembly law and that humanity's aggressive posturing was unhelpful to diplomatic resolution. The message ended with a suggestion that humanity reconsider its confrontational approach. Ambassador Marcus Webb received the message in his office and felt something inside him go very still. He had spent the last week trying to prevent what was coming, calling in every favor and making every argument he could craft. The assembly wouldn't listen. They truly believed that humanity was bluffing Marcus. Drafted his final message to the assembly council, it was short. You were warned and you chose not to listen, and what happens next is on you. He sent the message and then began the evacuation of all human civilians from assembly space. There weren't many, but he wanted every human out of potential danger zones before the clock ran out back on Earth. In a bunker deep beneath the Defense Ministry, Admiral Okonkwo met with the civilian leadership. Prime Minister was a woman named Catherine Torres who had built her career on peace and international cooperation. She looked like she had aged 10 years in the past week. Are we really doing this? She asked. Are we really going to war over a custody dispute? They're not in custody, Sarah said flatly. They're hostages, and the assembly is using them to prove that humanity can be pushed around because we've been peaceful for so long. 2,847 children, Catherine said quietly. Against how many lives if this turns into a real war? Ma'am, with respect, that's the wrong question. Sarah replied, the question is, what it means if we let them keep our children because we're too afraid to fight for them? Catherine closed her eyes. I spent my entire life working for peace. So did I. Sarah said, but peace is a choice we make, and they've made it impossible to choose, and our children are out there, scared and alone, and we're the only ones who can bring them home. The room fell silent finally. Catherine opened her eyes and nodded. 72 hours. She said, if they don't return our children, you have authorization to use whatever force is necessary to retrieve them. Sarah felt the weight of that authorization settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing understood. Ma'am, the countdown began across human space. Millions of people watched the clock and waited in the processing center scattered across assembly territory. Human children huddled together and wondered why their parents hadn't come for them. Yet they didn't know that their parents were coming. They just didn't know that the galaxy was about to learn what happened when you took a human's child. The 72 hours expired at midnight. Galactic Standard Time. No children had been returned at exactly 1 second past midnight. 12 human fleets materialized across assembly space in a coordinated jump that represented 2,000 years of suppressed military genius finally unleashed. Admiral Sarah Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the Remembrance as her fleet dropped into normal space near the Zelthorn Processing Center designated Facility 7 around her. The bridge crew worked with calm efficiency that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago, but they had trained on simulations pulled from archives that detailed every major engagement of the unification conflict. And somewhere deep in human DNA was the memory of how to fight. All ships report ready. Her tactical officer announced defensive positions established. Sarah pulled up the facility, scanned Facility 7 was a massive orbital complex holding approximately 300 human children. According to intelligence reports, it was also defended by a Zelthorn battle group, 2 heavy cruisers, 6 destroyers, and a cloud of automated defense platforms open a channel to the facility commander. Sarah ordered. The screen lit up with a Zelthorn officer who looked more annoyed than concerned. Human fleet, you are in violation of assembly space, the officer said. Withdraw immediately or face defensive action. I am Admiral Sarah Okonkwo of the Terran Defense Fleet. Sarah replied, you are holding 300 human children in that facility, and I am here to retrieve them, and you have one opportunity to surrender those children peacefully. The Zelthorn officer's compound eyes seemed to glitter with something like amusement. Admiral, you have 8 ships, and I have a full battle group, and you cannot possibly believe this threat will succeed. I'm not threatening you, Sarah said quietly. I'm telling you what's going to happen, and you're going to release those children. Or I'm coming through you to get them, The officer cut the channel. Sierra watched the tactical display as the Zelthorn ships moved into attack formation, their powering weapons. Her tactical officer reported multiple target locks on the flagship. Sarah felt something cold settle into her chest. A calm that came from knowing exactly what she was about to do and accepting the cost. All ships, she said, execute plan retrieval 7 and weapons free. What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for generations. Human ships moved with a coordination that seemed impossible for a species that hadn't fought a war in 2 millennia. They didn't fight like the assembly species fought. With careful preservation of valuable ships and measured exchanges of fire, they fought like humans had always fought when pushed far enough. With absolute commitment to the objective regardless of cost, the lead destroyer took fire from 3 Zelthorn ships, and instead of retreating, it accelerated directly into the defensive line. Its shields collapsed, but it kept coming. Weapons blazing, creating chaos in the enemy formation. 2 more human ships followed. Exploiting the gap, Sarah watched from the remembrance as her people executed maneuvers that would have been called reckless by any military standard, but reckless assumed you cared about survival. More than mission completion than these were humans. Fighting to retrieve children, the math was different. Cruiser Defiant is taking heavy damage, her tactical officer reported. Hull breaches on decks 4 through 7. Defiant, can you maintain position? Sarah asked. The cruiser captain's face appeared on screen, bleeding from a head wound. We can hold, Admiral, and we're keeping their attention off the boarding teams. The boarding teams, that was the real operation, while the Zelthorn focused on the fleet engagement. 3 human assault ships had slipped through the chaos and latched onto Facility 7, like parasites. Marines were cutting through the Hullen, another part of the battle space. A human corvette called the Swift Justice found itself surrounded by 2 Zelthorn destroyers. Captain Michael Torres, who had been a merchant captain 6 weeks ago, looked at his tactical display and made a decision that would haunt the nightmares of assembly officers for years. All power to engines, he ordered Ram. The station defenses. His crew didn't hesitate. The Swift Justice slammed into the automated defense grid at full acceleration, its shields collapsing on impact. The explosion tore a hole in the defensive perimeter large enough for the boarding teams to exploit. Captain Torres and his entire crew of 43 died in that collision, but they created the opening that let the Marines reach the children inside Facility 7. Sergeant Maria Santos led her team through corridors designed for beings much larger than humans. Facility guards were Zelthorn security forces, trained and equipped, but completely unprepared for human close quarters combat. Maria had been a school teacher 8 weeks ago. Now she moved through the facility with a rifle that felt both foreign and somehow natural in her hands. Her team encountered the first resistance at a security checkpoint. For guards in heavy armor, Maria didn't slow down. Her team had trained on scenarios pulled from archives of the unification conflict. Urban combat operations where humans had learned to fight in buildings, in tunnels, and anywhere that negated the enemy's advantages. They used breaching charges and suppression, fire, and tactical movement that flowed like water. The guards went down without killing any children in the crossfire, which was the only thing that mattered. Children located, Maria reported as they reached the holding area, approximately 80 in this section, and they appear unharmed. The children stared at the armed Marines with wide eyes. One little girl, maybe 6 years old, stepped forward. Are you here to take us home? She asked. Maria felt her throat tighten, but kept her voice steady. Yes, sweetheart, and we're taking all of you home to your parents. My mom said someone would come. The girl said she promised your mom was right. Maria said, now we need everyone to stay calm and follow my team, and we'll get you out of here back in space. Admiral Okonkwo watched the tactical situation develop. The Zelthorn battle group was regrouping, realizing too late that the human ships weren't trying to destroy the facility. They were providing cover for an extraction. Admiral, we have all boarding teams reporting success. Her tactical officer said. All children accounted for in beginning evacuation. Zelthorn cruiser is moving to intercept The boarding ship's weapons called out. Sarah looked at the display. The cruiser was heading directly for the unarmed transports that were pulling away from the facility. Those transports held 300 children. Remembrance. Intercept course, Sarah ordered. Put us between that cruiser and the transports, ma'am. We'll be taking fire from multiple angles, her executive officer warned, noted.
Ow.
Sarah said, execute. The Remembrance moved into position, its massive bulk shielding the smaller ship Selthorn. Weapons fire hammered into its shields. Warning alarms screamed across the bridge. Shields at 40%, tactical reported 30%, and failing the transports. Sarah asked, clear and jumping to hyperspace now. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. All ships fighting withdrawal and follow the transports home. The human fleet pulled back, their ships battered but intact behind them. Facility 7 hung in space with its defensive grid in ruins and its holding cells empty. 300 children were on their way home. Zelthorn High Arbiter Krath watched the battle. Recordings with growing horror. His military analysts had been wrong catastrophically. Wrong. Humans didn't fight like the other assembly species. With measured responses and careful preservation of assets, they fought with a ferocity that seemed to come from somewhere primal and ancient. And this had only been one facility intelligence. Reports were flooding in from across assembly. Space 11 more human fleets had hit processing centers. Simultaneously, the coordination was perfect. The execution was brutal, and the message was unmistakable. Humanity was coming for their children, and nothing would stop them. Krath called an emergency session of the Assembly Council. We must negotiate a ceasefire immediately, he said. The humans are not posturing, and they will not stop until they have recovered every child. They're bluffing. Another representative argued, this is just an initial show of force to pressure us. This was not a bluff, Krath said, playing the footage of the swift justice ramming the defense grid that Captain died to create an opening for boarding teams, and humans are willing to die for this. And how many of your species would sacrifice themselves for what amounts to a custody dispute? The chamber fell silent. We offered to return the children and pay reparations. Another representative suggested. A message appeared on the central display. Was from Admiral Okonkwo. Transmitted on all frequencies. We will take our children back, and your permission is not required, and this is not a negotiation. Krath looked around the chamber at representatives who were beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. They had forgotten that humanity's 2,000 years of peace was a choice, not a limitation, and they had just given humanity a reason to choose differently. The war that the Galactic Assembly had thought impossible spread across known space like fire through dry grass in the 3 weeks since humanity's first strike. 17 processing centers had been hit, and over 2,000 children had been recovered. The cost was mounting. 47 human ships had been destroyed. Over 3,000 soldiers and crew had died, and humanity showed no signs of stopping. Captain Wei Zhang commanded the destroyer, vigilant, and found himself leading a task force toward a Zelthone supply depot that intelligence indicated was routing resources to the remaining processing centers. His orders were clear: cut the supply lines and make it impossible for the Zelthone to maintain the facilities holding the L. Chilton Wei had been a cargo pilot before the war. No, he was hunting military targets deep in enemy territory. Captain, we're detecting a Vrin cruiser on intercept course. Sensor officer reported. The Vrin were one of the Assembly's member species, known for their powerful fleet and long military tradition. Hailed them. Wei ordered. The Vrin captain appeared on screen, a being with scaled skin and eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. Human vessel. I am Captain Thros of the Vrin Star Navy, and you are operating in Assembly space without authorization. Captain Thros, don't have a quarrel with the Vrin people, Wei said carefully. I'm here for a specific target, and I would prefer not to engage your ship. The Assembly has called for member species to enforce the peace, Thros replied. I have my orders. Wei looked at his tactical display. The Vrin cruiser outgunned his destroyer significantly in a straight fight. The Vigilant would lose, but Wei had studied the battles of the Unification conflict and learned that humans didn't always fight straight fights. Captain Thros, before we do this, I want you to understand something. Wei said. The Zelthorn took Our children, and we're not fighting for territory or resources or political power, and we're fighting to bring our kids home, and every human in this fleet would die before we stop trying. Something flickered in Thross's eyes. I have children of my own, the Vryn captain said quietly. If someone took them, I would burn worlds to get them back. Then you understand why I can't turn around. Way said. For a long moment, the two ships hung in space. Finally, Thross spoke. My sensors are experiencing technical difficulties. He said, by the time they are repaired, you will likely be gone, and I will file a report noting an equipment malfunction. The Vryn cruiser turned and jumped to hyperspace way, let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Captain, what just happened? His executive officer asked. We met someone who understands, Way said across assembly space. Similar encounters were playing out. Some species fought alongside the Zelthorn, honoring their alliance obligations, but many were quietly withdrawing, unwilling to die defending what they increasingly saw as an indefensible action. You didn't take someone's children and expect them to respond with restraint. That was a universal truth that transcended species on the colony world of New Haven. Sarah Morrison received a message that her daughter Emma had been recovered from Facility 12. She stood in the middle of the street and cried for the first time since the Zelthorn had taken Emma 4 weeks ago, but her tears were cut short by another message. There were still 847 children unaccounted. Fourth largest group, nearly 800, were being held in a massive orbital complex called the Zelthorn Primary Detention Facility. It was the most heavily defended location in Zelthorn space, surrounded by their home fleet and protected by defense systems that represented centuries of military development. Intelligence indicated the Zelthorn were consolidating all remaining human children there. It was a fortress on humanity was going to break it. Young Lieutenant Anna Chen, formerly a philosophy student, sat in the briefing room aboard the assault carrier Redemption and listened as the mission commander outlined the attack plan. The room was packed with Marines, most of them civilians. Just months ago, now they were about to assault the most defended position in Zelthorn space. We're looking at minimum 30% casualties, the commander said bluntly, possibly as high as 50%, and anyone who wants to transfer to rear duty should speak up now, and there's no shame in it. Nobody spoke and looked around at faces that should have been in classrooms or offices, or anywhere but here. But they were here because 800 children needed someone to come get them. One more thing. The commander said the Zelthorn are threatening to use the children as leverage if we attack, and they're saying they'll harm them if we don't withdraw. The room went very still. Anna felt rage flowed through her like molten metal around her. She could feel the same fury radiating from every Marine in the room. They won't, someone said quietly. Anna turned to see her old professor, Dr. James Chen, standing in the doorway. He was wearing a combat uniform now, having volunteered as a historical consultant and then somehow ended up training Marines. How do you know? The commander asked. Because they made a threat they can't follow through on. James said if they harm those children, there is no force in this galaxy that will stop humanity from reducing Zelthorn space to atoms. And they're smart enough to know that, and they're bluffing because they've finally realized what they're facing. And what are they facing? Professor? Anna asked. James looked at his former student and then around at all the young faces watching him. Us. He said simply, they're facing humans who are fighting for their children, and that makes us the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. The assault fleet gathered at the edge of Zelthorn home system. 20 capital ships, 40 destroyers, and 100 support vessels. It was the largest human military force assembled in 2,000 years. Admiral Sarah Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the Remembrance and looked at the tactical display showing the Zelthorn defensive positions. They had 3 battle stations, dozens of ships, and enough firepower to destroy her fleet twice over. Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from the Zelthorn High Arbiter. Her communications officer, Reporter Krath, appeared on screen. Sarah could see the strain in his expression. Admiral Okonkwo, I am authorized to offer a complete ceasefire, he said. We will return all remaining children and pay substantial reparations and withdraw the juvenile custody directive, and all we ask is that you halt your advance. Sarah felt the weight of 3,000 dead crew members the memory of children crying for their parents, and the knowledge that 800 kids were sitting in a facility waiting for rescue High Arbiter. 3 weeks ago, I would have accepted that offer, she said, but you waited too long and you let our children sit in your facilities while you negotiated and you used them as bargaining chips. And now the only negotiation matters is this. Send out the children. Where we come in, you cannot win this battle, Krath said desperately. You will lose ships and people, and for what? We're offering to give you everything you want. You're offering to give us what was always ours. Sarah replied, our children, and we're not asking for your permission to take them home. She cut the transmission all ships. She ordered, begin the assault, and remember that those children are counting on us, and bring them home. The human fleet accelerated toward the Zelthorn defensive line across the fleet. Thousands of humans prepared to fight, not for conquest or glory or any of the traditional reasons species went to war. They were fighting because somewhere in that facility were 800 children who just wanted to go home, and humanity had decided that was worth any cost. The redemption. Anna Chen checked her rifle one last time and looked at the other Marines in her unit. For the children, someone said quietly. The phrase rippled through the assault bay. For the children, it became a chant. Then Arana felt it in her chest. This connection to every other human in the fleet. They were all someone's child and somewhere ahead. 800 children were waiting for someone to prove that no power in the galaxy could keep humans from their kids. The battle for the Zelthorn primary detention facility was about to begin. The galaxy was about to learn its final lesson about humanity. You could negotiate with humans, trade with them, even become their friends, but you could never, ever take their children. The battle for the Zelthorn primary detention facility lasted 18 hours and became known as the longest day in human military history since the unification. Conflict Admiral Sarah Okonkwo watched from the remembrance as her fleet engaged the Zelthorn home defense force in a battle that lit up the darkness of space with weapons, fire, and explosions. The Zelthorn fought. Well, they were a military species with centuries of experience, and they used every advantage they had, but they were fighting to defend a position humanity was fighting to save. Children, the math had never been in the Zelthorns favor. Multiple breaches in the outer defense perimeter. Sarah's tactical officer reported assault teams are beginning their approach on the redemption. Anna Chen and her unit launched from the assault carrier and armored drop pods. The pods were barely more than metal boxes with thrusters, designed to get Marines from ship to station through the chaos of battle. Anna's pod shook violently as point defense fire tried to knock it out of space. 2 pods in. Her unit took direct hits and vanished in bright flashes. Anna closed her eyes and thought about the children waiting inside the facility. Her pod slammed into the station hull and cutting. Torches activated automatically, burning through the armor. Marines poured through the breach inside. The facility was a maze of corridors and holding cells designed to hold thousands. Intelligence had provided layouts, but nothing prepared Anna for the sheer size of the place. Stay in formation. Her sergeant ordered, we clear each section methodically, and we don't leave anyone behind. The Zelthorn security forces fought hard. They were defending their home system, and they knew retreat meant the end of their species. Standing in the assembly, but the humans who came through those breaches were parents and teachers and engineers who had been transformed by necessity into soldiers, and they were absolutely relentless. Anna's unit cleared 3 levels before they encountered heavy resistance. A barricaded checkpoint with automated weapons and a full platoon of Zelthorn troops. Her sergeant looked at the situation and started calling for support. Anna heard a sound that stopped her. Cold, crying children crying. Just beyond the barricade, there are kids in there, she said. The sergeant looked at her. We need to wait for heavy weapons, and we can't just charge through. Anna thought about her professor, Dr. Chen, and all his lectures about the terrible things humans had done during the siege. Unification conflict. She thought about the capacity for violence that every human carried on. She thought about the children on the other side of that barricade, or we go through, she said quietly before the sergeant could respond. Anna was moving. She grabbed a breaching charge and sprinted toward the barricade. Using covering fire from her unit Selthorn weapons, fire tore through the air around. Hershey felt something hit her shoulder, but her armor held and she kept running. She slapped the charge against the barricade and dove for cover. The explosion tore through the fortification and Nas unit poured through the gap. The firefight was brutal, and Closana took down 2 Zelthorn soldiers and felt nothing except the need to get to those children when the smoke cleared. The barricade was breached and the crying was louder. Anna stumbled through the wreckage and found them, 43 children, huddled together in a holding cell. The oldest was maybe 12. The youngest couldn't have been more than 5. "We're here," Anna said, her voice breaking. "We're here to take you home, eh?" The little boy looked up at her with tear-stained cheeks. "My dad said you'd come. He whispered. He said, humans always come for their children." Anna felt tears running down her face. "Your dad was right," she said. "Let's get you out of here in space." The battle was reaching its climax. Remembrance had taken catastrophic damage. Half her decks were open to space, and fires burned in 3 separate sections. Admiral Okonkwo was bleeding from a head wound, but she refused to leave the bridge. All assault teams report successful extraction. Her communications officer announced all children accounted for and moving to evacuation points. Sarah felt relief wash over her. 800 children's dead. Found them all. Zelthorn's flagship is making one last push. Tactical. Warned they're trying to cut off the evacuation route. Sarah looked at her display. The Zelthorn Admiral was making a desperate move, sacrificing smaller ships to get his flagship into position to threaten the transports. Those transports held every recovered child. Sarah made her decision. All power to engines, she ordered, ramming speed. Her crew turned to look at her. Admiral, her executive officer, started. "Those are our children on those transports," Sarah said quietly, "and nobody gets between us and our kids," and set collision course for the flagship. The Remembrance turned and accelerated. The massive battlecruiser, already dying, made one final run. The Zelthorn flagship tried to evade, but the Remembrance was committed at the last moment. Sarah ordered all hands to evacuate. Most of her crew made it to escape pod. Sarah stayed on the bridge. The Remembrance struck the Zelthorn flagship at full speed. The explosion lit up the entire battle space. Both ships died together, but the transports got clear on the evacuation transport. Hope's return. Anna Chen held the little boy who had told her about his father's promise. She watched through the viewport as the Remembrance made its final run. "Why did they do that?" the boy asked. "Because you matter more than anything," Anna said softly. "Because every adult out here would die before letting anything happen to you." The human fleet, battered and bleeding, pulled back from Zelthorn space behind them. They left wreckage and chaos, but every single transport held children going home on Earth. Sarah Morrison stood at the spaceport with thousands of other parents. The transports were coming down. Emma appeared in the crowd of children, and Sarah ran to her, scooping her daughter into her arms. Around them, families reunited. There was crying and laughter and joy, but also grief. 347 human soldiers had died in the assault on the detention facility, including Admiral Sarah Okonkwo, who had sacrificed herself to ensure the children made it home in the weeks that followed. The Galactic Assembly held emergency sessions. The Zelthorn sued for peace. Humanity accepted there would be no conquest, no revenge. The human fleet simply returned to their space. Children were home. That was all that had ever mattered. The ambassador, Marcus Webb, who had survived the war in assembly space, delivered humanity's final statement to the council. The chamber was packed. Every species wanted to hear what humanity would say now that they had demonstrated their capacity for total war. Marcus stood at the podium and looked around at representatives who now understood what they had awakened for 2,000 years. "We kept a promise to ourselves," said. "We promised that we would never let our capacity for violence define us again, and we chose peace. Even when it was hard, and we chose cooperation. Even when we disagreed, and we chose restraint. Even when we were provoked, the chamber was silent. You broke that peace." Marcus continued, "Not through malice, perhaps, But through arrogance, and you took our children, and you assumed we would negotiate, and you assumed wrong, he paused, looking directly at the Zelthorn delegation. We did what was necessary to bring our children home, and now we return to our promise, and we choose peace again. But every species in this assembly has now seen what humanity becomes when you threaten what we love. Most Marcus let that sink in. We will never start a war, he said. We will never seek conquest, and we will never choose violence when other options exist. But if you force our hand again, if you ever threaten our children or our families or the things we hold sacred, we will finish it, and we will finish it completely. He gathered his notes. That is all I have to say, and I hope we never have this conversation again.
Ow.
Marcus walked out of the chamber behind him. The assembly sat in silence. The Zelthorn High Arbiter, Krath, watched him go and felt the weight of what his species had. Learned humanity had been peaceful for 2,000 years, not because they couldn't fight, but because they chose not to. That choice was what made them terrifying, because a species that could choose peace despite having the capacity for total war was a species that understood exactly what violence costs, and they were willing to pay that cost for their children. In the months that followed, the galaxy changed. Species that had dismissed humanity as reformed warmongers now gave them a wide berth. Treaties were honored more carefully, disputes were settled more quickly, and no one, absolutely no one, ever threatened human children again in New Haven. Life returned to something like normal. Sarah Morrison watched Emma play with her friends. Laughing in the orange light of the twin suns, she thought about Admiral Conquo and all the others who had died. She thought about the terrible choice humanity had made to become what they had sworn never to be again, even temporarily, because the alternative was abandoning their children some nights. Sarah couldn't sleep. She would think about the weapons training, about the willingness to fight, about how easily humans had remembered how to make war. But then Emma would crawl into bed with her, seeking comfort from a nightmare, and Sarah would hold her daughter close on. She would know that the choice had been right, because some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth any cost. Your children were always worth it. The galaxy had learned that lesson on humanity, went back to being peaceful. But now everyone understood what that P